A couple of days ago, we got a slurry of leaks of the Canon EOS R7, followed by the Canon EOS R10, and a couple of RFS kit lenses. The due date, June or July. But the dates have changed again. Details coming up, but first I encourage you to subscribe and choose all notifications so you're kept informed on the latest camera gear, news and rumors, and ever-changing dates. Information really does change very quickly around here. It was just a couple of days ago we got the full leak specifications of the Canon EOS R7, along with some leaks of the Canon EOS R10 and some kit lenses. And Canon rumors said that the date for announcement was most likely going to be June or July. Well, that changed just about a day after that. We now have the actual announcement date for both of these cameras and the kit lenses. And the announcement date? May the 24th, 2022, not 2023, May the 24th. That's a week before Fujifilm's X Summit. Yeah, the Fujifilm X Summit is going to be on May the 31st, 2022. Canon is preempting that summit with their own cameras. They did this with Sony a couple of years ago, and they're doing it here again. Remember that NAB 2020? Canon came out and announced theirs on the same date as Sony, adjusted the time, and then Sony, about an hour or two later, decided, yeah, we're going to go a week later. So really interesting on the date change. Okay, now that we've gotten the dates out of the way, I want to talk a little bit about the specifications for the R7 because there's been an awful lot of heated discussion over what's included and what's been left out. First off, let's take a look at that sensor. 32.5 megapixel APS-C sensor. Now many have said, wait a minute, no BSI, no stack, this is ridiculous. Well, keep in mind, while these are CR3, meaning that they're validated by multiple sources, it doesn't mean that we're getting the full picture, and we clearly don't have the full picture. There's a lot missing. We don't have ISO, we don't have dynamic range, so what's to say that the sensor isn't actually BSI or stacked? That information has been left out because either it's not there or because they're playing with us, because they're teasing us a little bit more along. We've still got 2 weeks until the announcement. So it might not be BSI, it might not be stacked, but I think there's still a pretty good chance, there's still a pretty good probability that we could at least get a BSI 32.5 megapixel sensor, APS-C sensor. So let's not get too upset. Let's not get too excited. The great thing about rumors is they create a lot of anticipation and excitement, as you can see on my face right now. I love rumors. They're so much exciting. They're so fun that I can't even get my words out and speak properly. This reminds me of the Canon EOS R5. For about 4 months up until the announcement, there was leaks coming out all the time. But what was really nice is every 3 to 5 weeks, Canon would come out with some sort of announcement, a development announcement, or they'd come out at NAB and they'd just squeeze out a little bit more information about the R5. So we had validation every month or so. And here we haven't. We're just going to have to wait a few weeks to find out what the final specifications are. But there's a lot in this camera to be excited about. 32.5 megapixels is still an awful lot for an APS-C sensor. And I think it's a good amount. I'm pretty happy with the 20 megapixels on the Canon 70D, and I think anywhere from around 24 to 30 megapixels is a good range. Yeah, it might not be a BSI sensor, it might not be BSI or stacked, but still, it's looking to be a pretty impressive camera. Dual pixel autofocus. Now, there's no mention in the leak specifications if that's going to be dual pixel autofocus too, but I'd be surprised if it wasn't. Still, dual pixel autofocus is a great system. Now, the Canon R5C had dual pixel autofocus, but not dual pixel autofocus 2. So there is a chance that we might not get the full-blown version. But again, this is the R7. This is the flagship APS-C mirrorless camera. I'd be surprised if Canon really cuts corners. And that's why I'd be surprised, honestly, if it wasn't a BSI sensor. So we'll just have to wait and see. And as far as the frame rate here, 15 frames per second mechanical. Think about that, 15 frames per second mechanical. This is a big deal. The Canon EOS R5 only does 12 frames, and the Canon 1DX Mark III, the current flagship DSLR camera in Canon's lineup, does 16. 15 frames per second mechanical. That's a pretty aggressive number. And what kind of worries me about that number is I remember the 1DX Mark III, after about the first couple of months, you would get some oil from the shutter just leaking onto the sensor. So I hope this doesn't have that problem. But if you really want to go fast, 30 frames per second. That's right up there with the Sony Alpha 1. 30 frames per second in electronic mode. And this is a super big deal. And when I see this, when I see 30 frames per second, all I can think of is we're a long ways away from that Digic 8 processor. I believe we're going to have the Digic X processor in here. So even if that sensor isn't BSI, keep in mind the Canon EOS R5, what it can do with the Digic X processor and a non-BSI or stacked sensor. And that's another thing I want to talk about that sensor. When we look at the frame rate here of 30 frames per second electronic, when we look at the sensor, 32.5 megapixel APS-C sensor, don't be too concerned if it's not BSI or stacked. The Canon EOS R5 can do 8K over, or not 8K over sample video, 8K video up to 30 frames per second raw at a sustained bit rate of 325 megabytes per second, recording from the sensor through the processor, through the data bus, all the way down to a CF Express Type B card at 325 megabytes per second. And that's not BSI or stacked. So let's not worry about individual specs. Let's worry about the entire outcome of what this is going to be able to produce. And that video that it's going to be able to produce, so great, we can do 30 frames per second electronic, we can do 15 frames per second continuous shooting stills. But the video side, it can do 4K 60 frames per second, 24, 25, 30, 50, and 60 frames per second. And again, many of us are wondering, well, wait a minute, this camera at 32.5 megapixels should be able to do 6K video. It should be able to do 6K over sample 4K. And you're right, it should be able to do that. And again, we don't know that it can't. Just because something hasn't been leaked doesn't mean it's not going to be there. Keep in mind, last week we didn't have any leaked specifications for the R7. So one could argue that we're not getting an R7. So let's kind of relax a little bit here and look at the R7, look at 4K 60. There's no mention if that 4K 60 won't be 4.1K oversampled, 5.1K oversampled, 6K oversampled, 6.2K oversampled 4K. It's possible that we still could be getting that. They're just not giving us all the specifications about what that 4K is. If we go back a couple of years, it was pretty much given that we were buying an APS-C censored camera or even a full frame camera from Canon on their DSLR, you were getting something like a heavy crop of 1.6 or 1.7 times, which was a little bit frustrating. I really do hope those days are gone, at least on the R7. We'll just have to wait and see for sure, but full sensor readout would make a lot of sense. This is going to be their flagship APS-C, and if they want to get that dollar rate around $2,000, which is what many of us anticipate it to be, they're not going to be able to do that if they don't produce really good 4K video. At least 4K 30 needs to be sharp and detailed, and really in this day and age, so does 4K 60. And this isn't me with inside knowledge, but based on everything I know what's been coming forth from Canon, I'd be really surprised if it's overly cropped and the image is soft. And what about 1080? Well, 1080, we get up to 120 frames per second. Some previous rumors said 240. 120 frames per second is a lot. Sure, I would like 240 or even 480, but for that, we're essentially going to have to go to video cameras. I know there are a few exceptions to Micro Four Thirds that can do 240 frames per second. But what matters to me more than anything else, if it can deliver 120 frames per second and do it with more detail than the Canon EOS R5, I'll be impressed. But in that case, I don't think it'll be able to do that unless, of course, it is a BSI or stacked sensor, because the R5, with everything it's got, does produce a little bit soft footage. Well, compared to the 8K oversample 4K, it's soft. So if the R7 can produce more detailed video in 1080, I think that would be a huge win, and I think that would be absolutely incredible. But one thing is really, really awesome. Taking a look at that 4K 60 again, we're getting Canon Log 3. Whenever you get Canon Log in a camera, on a Canon camera, that usually means 10-bit 422 as well. So that 4K 60 video is going to be 10-bit 422. You're going to get Canon Log 3. And I'm going to be honest with you, getting Canon Log 3 for video, if you've never shot with Log, I'm going to be honest with you, it produces truly incredible results. I've been shooting with Canon Log 3 since it came out. I've been shooting with Canon Log 1 about 4 to 6 months before that. Canon Log 1, I felt like I was arguing with the camera. I just could never get things right. It was very frustrating. And I felt like an idiot because I just couldn't grade things right. But as soon as Canon Log 3 came out, I thought, wow, this is so much easier to grade. And the detail, where you really notice it, even on a sunny day, you're shooting, you've got a landscape, and there's always going to be areas where it's a little bit dark, like shaded by the trees. And if you're shooting 8-bit without Canon Log, that's more or less going to be the shadows where you're not going to be able to pull any detail out of. But now you shoot Canon Log 3 in those areas, you can see into the shadows, there's detail there. It's almost like looking at the landscape with your own eyes, to the point where you can't go back to 8-bit. So Canon Log 3 is a super big deal. And that is really going to impress me an awful lot. Now, the Canon EOS R5 can produce 4K 60 sharp, but most of the reason for that is because it's doing oversamples. So again, going back to that oversampling, I really do hope they have oversampling. That, to me, matters far more than being a BSI sensor. So we'll just have to wait and see on that. But Canon Log 3, we also get HDR-PQ, which is really, really handy. And of course, something that we've been complaining about for a long time is the lack of dual card slots. Now, there won't be a CF Express Type B card slot like was previously rumored, but it is getting 2 UHS 2 card slots, which means you can use V90 cards. I want to tell you a little bit about these types of cards. So I've been shooting with the R5 for a long time. I've used all the cards. I've used V30 cards, and I've got V90 cards, the Angelbird V90 card. And I got to tell you, you can record 4K 30 all I onto a V30 card. I don't know what the R7 is going to do. I don't know if it's going to do IPB. I don't know if it's going to do IPB Lite, all I, or RAW in any of the modes. But if you're recording 4K 30 all I, based on the Canon R5, that's 470 megabits per second, and a V30 card can take it. You want to make sure you get a good V30 card, a V30 card that's designed for video. But a V30 card can take 4K video. And it should be able to record to both card slots. The R5 has a firmware to do it. So it's just about Canon allowing that. To be able to record video to both card slots is important. However, this is the big however. If you record a lot of longer videos, and we're not talking about a minute or two, we're talking about north of 10 minutes. Well, just 10 minutes to move that content off of a V30 card onto your computer is almost minute for minute. It can take you 10 minutes or more. So in those cases, you're going to want to invest in V90 cards. Skip V60, go right to V90 to get the maximum transfer speed. But here's the problem with V90 cards. They cost almost as much, and in many cases, I've seen them cost more than, you know, your standard Angelbird AV Pro SE or SX cards that cost $179.99, if I remember correctly, for 500 gigabytes. 500 gigabytes, and you can't get anywhere close to that amount of storage on a V30 SD card. So there are some kind of negatives with the SD cards, but if you're going to be shooting a lot of video, like I said, you're going to want to invest in the V90 cards. Even if it's only a 128 gig card, it's going to make a huge difference. Trust me. If you're an amateur, you're a hobbyist like me, and you're not worried about time, then yeah, you can work with the V30 cards, but trust me, it's going to get in the way. It's going to get annoying. As prices start to come down, as sales start to happen, you want to grab a couple of those V90 cards. And good news, this camera, the R7, gets IBIS, and it's going to look very similar to the R5 in terms of the mold and layout of the buttons and everything. But yeah, I know. I think this is a pretty impressive camera. We don't know the price. We now know it's supposed to come out on May the 24th, 2022, just a couple of weeks away, less than 2 weeks away. But I think it looks pretty impressive. 4K 60, IBIS, Canon Log 3, 30 frames per second electronic, a 32.5 megapixel sensor. Yes, there's a lot we don't know about. And yes, these are the only leaked specifications, but please, just keep in mind that this is all that has been leaked. I've seen this with the Canon R5 many, many times. We had a whole bunch of leaks on January the 27th, 2020, and there was like 12 to 15 items leaked, and they were pretty detailed. And one of them was 8K RAW. 8K RAW video up to 30 frames per second. Then a day or two later, Canon rumors came out and said, okay, hold on, it's going to do 8K video up to 30 frames per second. And it's kind of stayed that way until pretty much the announcement, when then it was confirmed that it's doing 8K RAW with autofocus, with IBIS, up to 30 frames per second with a 325 megabyte sustained transmission of data. That's a pretty big deal. We didn't have a clear picture of all the specifications on that first leak, but as time went by, the leaks started to solidify themselves. So who knows? Maybe between now and May the 24th, we'll get updates and verifications on these specifications. Maybe today we'll get some further specifications. And that's why it's a good idea to go ahead and subscribe and choose all notifications. And by choosing all notifications, as soon as I put out a new video, you're going to get notified, so that way you can stay in the know on the latest camera news and rumors, like everything that's going on with the R7. And we haven't really even talked about the R10. So with the Canon EOS R10, we have even less information on the sensor. 24.2 megapixels, that's it. Now, it's obviously assumed it's going to be APS-C, but all we have is the sensor size, 24.2 megapixels, which is considerably less than what we have on the 90D and the M6. which are what? 32.5. But somebody else also brought up, well, maybe this camera, the R10, isn't meant as a replacement of the 90D and the M6 Mark II, but more of the M50, and that would certainly make sense. Again, we have very little information here. We don't know how many other cameras are coming out, but we're getting an announcement of 2 APS-C cameras on the mirrorless mount, the R system, that RF mount, and that's a big deal. And in terms of stills, the shutter speed, frames per second continuous shooting, we're looking at 15 frames per second mechanical and 23 frames per second electronic. So the same mechanical rate as the R7, but a slower electronic speed. And that makes me wonder, is the Digic X processor going to be in this camera? Or is Canon just segmenting it because, well, if you can get the same frame rate as the R7 and all you care about is stills, well, why don't you just get that camera instead? Again, we don't know if it's going to be BSI or stacked. All we do have is that megapixel amount. We've got the frame rate of 15 to 23 frames per second, and it's going to have a single UHS-2 card slot, and it's going to do PD, or not PD, HDR-PQ. I don't know why I can never say that acronym, but no mention of Canon Log 3. The R10 is very light in terms of specifications, and I would expect within the next couple of days we're going to get more specifications coming through on the Canon EOS R10. So again, like, subscribe, and choose all notifications, and more information is going to be coming out pretty quickly. But it's early here in the morning. It's just after 6 o'clock, and I thought I'd get this recorded and out by 7 or 8 before I start work. So you guys have got something to enjoy with your coffee in the morning, or maybe you're in Asia, Australasia, where it's nighttime, and this is what you're going to get before you go to bed. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again soon.